You've heard plenty from me about the absolute travesty that befell the 9-hour-long documentary about Prince produced for Netflix and subsequently canceled under pressure from the Prince estate. I have a playlist here at The Curious Listener. You can go down that playlist and find all easily Prince documentary videos that I have made over the past several months now. For all the background, I cover every inch of territory that this story encompasses in those videos. Okay. What you have not heard, however, is the director of that documentary, Ezra Edelman, himself speaking out about this, because he hasn't done so, with one minor exception of a couple little quotes in a New York Times Magazine story that came out months ago. I did a long video about that as well that you can find on the playlist. He hasn't spoken out about this until just the other day. There is a guy named Pablo Torre who has a podcast on here. Wonderful guy, seems like a lot of fun, does a nice job on there. Pablo Torre finds out. Maybe you're already familiar with this particular podcast. Well, he also happens to be a friend of Ezra Edelman's, going back years, it seems, and finally persuaded Ezra, which it seems clear it was no easy task, because he is not a man who is given to put himself out there publicly and mouth off about much of anything, and certainly not one to toot his own horn in public. But he finally did persuade Ezra Edelman to come into his studio and talk this out, give us his side of the story. And oh, what an anguished side of the story it is. At times it's painful just watching the look on Ezra Edelman's face, the body language that betrays the anguish, the bewilderment, the frustration, the disbelief, the disgust, the concern for the present and future of his craft as a documentarian, all emotions that emerged from the experience of spending, as he puts it, 1/10 of his life. He is a 50-year-old man who began this project at age 45, okay, working on this film, only for it to be locked away in the vault, the inaccessible vault of the Prince estate's short-sightedness on this issue. A short-sightedness that, in my view and Ezra Edelman's, amounts to nothing short of an act of sabotage against Prince's legacy. They think they're helping this guy out. They think they're helping Prince's legacy, and they are not. They are doing exactly the opposite. They are hurting him by denying him this chance at what Edelman describes as the gift of epic-length documentary treatment of this man's life. That is exactly what this trailblazing genius of an artist in Prince deserves. They pressured the Prince estate into canceling this documentary because, God forbid, it acknowledges the man's humanity, as Ezra Edelman very powerfully puts it at one point in this documentary, in this podcast. At one point, as you'll hear from me in a moment, quoting Jill Jones, who, as you recall, if you've watched any of my prior videos on this, if you know much of anything about Prince's backstory, if you yourself have read up on the contents of this documentary, Pablo Torre, by the way, is someone who has seen this documentary. He is one of the friends, that's how close he and Ezra are, who got to attend the screening of this documentary. I think that was in the summer of 2024, summer of last year. There was a screening of this documentary. Okay. So he has seen this documentary. Pablo Torre knows the subject of which he speaks here. Okay. He is able to bring that familiarity with the project to bear in this conversation with its creator, Ezra Edelman. The treatment, it seems, that Ezra Edelman gave Prince, that I just said, was the kind of treatment of which Prince is absolutely deserving, given his immense accomplishment. Was a treatment that dug deep enough to cull some honest and illuminating understanding of how the personal circumstances of Prince's life and the circumstances of American culture in the moment in which he was producing this glittering, blazingly brilliant song catalog gave rise to such a creative phenomenon, such a trailblazing genius as this. And that's part of the conversation that Pablo Torre has with Ezra Edelman. I am so grateful that Ezra saw fit to finally step up and give us his side of the story, at least lend some voice to the struggle that this documentary became for him. So this interview that he does with Pablo Torre is about 45 minutes long. Obviously, I'll link to it in the description of this video. You can go click on it there and watch it for yourself, which I heartily hope you will do. It's just some backstory here before we get into the contents of this really important conversation really illuminating conversation, and at times anguishing and heartbreaking conversation that Pablo Torre has with Ezra Edelman, whose documentary, which apparently is titled The Book of Prince, has been canceled by Netflix, the rights turned over to the Prince estate, locked away forever. Ezra Edelman, at one point, Pablo Torre quotes him as saying that there's a 0.000 repeating chance that the world ever gets to see this documentary. He has zero hope that we'll ever be availed of this documentary. So Ezra Edelman, quick recap. Okay, this guy won an Academy Award for his 2016 documentary about O.J. Simpson called O.J. Made in America. That documentary made history in a couple of important respects. And it is in this way that Ezra Edelman's unique talent comes to the fore. It was a nearly 8-hour-long serialized documentary about the O.J. Simpson's life and the O.J. Simpson case, produced for ESPN, debuted on ABC, also shown in theaters. Now, that positioned this film uniquely to earn both an Emmy for the television side of things and an Oscar for its feature film treatment when it was shown in theaters. Okay? That was historic because I believe to this day it still stands as the only documentary to win both an Emmy and an Oscar, blurring the boundary between television and feature film treatment, as I've discussed on this topic here previously at The Curious Listener. Okay? The result of that? The Academy decided in its infinite wisdom to heretofore ban from eligibility in the Best Documentary category any serialized or documentary that's divided up into a series. Okay? Such is the disruptive nature of Ezra Edelman's own genius as a documentarian. In fact, at one point in this conversation, and I love this, Pablo says that this happened because the documentary was, quote, so unfairly good. I love that way of putting it. At one point, Pablo just goes ahead and calls Ezra Edelman the best documentarian in America. Okay? It would seem that the reverberations of his genius as a documentarian playing out in such dramatic ways as they have testifies to that fact that Ezra Edelman is a force to contend with in the documentary space. Okay, now all that backstory aside, here comes Netflix. I think the timing is such that this must have happened shortly before COVID. Netflix calls Ezra Edelman and says, hey, got this idea for a Prince documentary, and it's not just an idea. We have exclusive access to Prince's archives, which no one else on planet Earth has ever seen. Would you be interested in taking on this project, Mr. Academy Award-winning documentarian? Now, there's a lot more backstory to this. Again, I've gone over all of this. Go to that playlist on my channel for the backstory here. I mean, there was a prior director who withdrew from the project. Ezra himself felt some hesitancy before accepting the project. You can go back and get the goods on all of that here at The Curious Listener, okay? Now, he ultimately does accept the project. He spends the next five and a half years of his life slaving over it. In the meantime, some important factors came into play. For one, the Prince estate changes hands. Okay, so the people in the Prince estate who grudgingly are not okayed this project to begin with, the estate changes hands and does so by entering the hands of those who feel more opposed to the project than supportive of it. And as a reminder, the Prince estate is a dysfunctional cluster because Prince, despite reportedly having a net worth of about $200 million at the time of his death in 2016, died without a will in place. Yes, Prince had no will in place at the time of his death. That left some serious chaos. I've gone over all of the, at times, absurd fights as people who had no claim whatsoever to Prince's net worth try to claw their way into things with ridiculous stories about how they were distant relatives of his or all this just crazy stuff, okay? In addition to that, however, there was a key layoff at Netflix, an executive at Netflix who herself signed off on this project. She is fired, removing another important layer of support for the project. And as all this is unfolding, Ezra's still working on the film, right? And he starts to see this film probably is never going to see the light of day. Nonetheless, he continues working his ass off on it. Finishes it, screens it for some friends who invariably perceived it to be brilliant. That is documented in the New York Times Magazine story that's thousands of words long by um, that I discussed here at The Curious Listener in a long video on that subject prior. Again, go to the playlist for that. The Prince estate, after the screening, they see it too. They subsequently, as I said, pressure Netflix to shelve it. Ultimately, Netflix cancels the whole thing, turns the rights over to the estate, and now the whole thing's dead, and Ezra, as I said, believes the world will never get to see it. Which brings us to Mr. Pablo Torres, who persuaded Ezra to sit down and talk about this. And there's an important moment about 16 minutes into this conversation when Ezra turns the tables on Pablo, and he becomes the interrogator. And it's a fascinating moment that gets right to the pit of Edelman's agony as the creator of this 9-hour labor of love that the world now will never see. He looks at Pablo and he says, "How old are you, Pablo?" 39, Pablo says. "And what was your relationship to Prince before you saw this movie, Pablo?" Pablo says, "Well, extraordinarily minimal. I mean, he was represented in cartoons. He was the guy performing with Slave written on his cheek. He was the artist formerly known as." Edelman cuts in here and says, "Were you a fan, Pablo?" Pablo says, "I wouldn't self-identify as a fan, but certainly I knew that this guy was really good at what he does." Edelman takes this a step further and says, "What was your relationship to Prince after having seen this movie?" At which point Pablo says, quote, "My main sensation after watching it was this is one of the most impressive artists that has ever lived." To which Edelman responds as follows: "This is the thing that I just find galling. I mean, I can't get past this. Like the short-sightedness of a group of people whose interest is their own bottom line. They're afraid of his Prince's humanity. The interest is their own bottom line. They're afraid of his humanity." The lawyer who represents the estate said, and I discussed this in prior videos, that this film would, quote, "do generational harm to Prince." In essence, in Ezra's words here, that the portrayal of Prince in this film, what people would learn about him, would deter younger fans potentially from loving Prince. They would be turned off. This, I think, was the big issue here. And again, he says, this is a gift, a 9-hour treatment about an artist who was, by the way, effing brilliant. You get to, Ezra continues, bathe in Prince's genius, but you also confront his humanity. God forbid, you mean Prince was a human being, prone to flaws like the rest of us are? That's a topic I've discussed at great length previously here. The absurdity of it, the immaturity underlying this absurd refusal to acknowledge that the man was a human being too, in addition to having also been a creative genius. The Prince estate is all worked up about nothing here. They have created a drama that was totally unnecessary. And I believe time will bear that out. It's at this point in the conversation when Edelman pulls his phone out and Pablo is like, "I was wondering, why is your phone out?" Well, we quickly find out, and my God, what power emerges from what he reads off of his phone at that moment. Jill Jones, who posted on social media, I believe it was an Instagram post, her reaction to news that this documentary had been canceled. She herself was interviewed as part of its production. It's her story about Prince punching her in the face at one point in her life that the documentary puts out there. And there's a lot to say about the predicament that that revelation put Ezra Edelman in that I think is really important for us to consider. I'll get to that in a second. But Ezra Edelman describes Jill Jones as someone who spent the 80s with Prince. That was it. That was his peak. That was his prime. That's when Purple Rain comes out in 1984, and he owns the decade as a pop artist from there. I mean, he and Michael Jackson, right, are in contention for King of Pop status. Michael, of course, crowned himself as such, but man, Prince was right up there with him, wasn't he? I mean, he dominated. I've talked about this before, the airwaves with Purple Rain. And then later with the gorgeous Parade soundtrack with things like Sometimes It Snows in April on it. Very late 80s, early 90s. He's writing songs like Manic Monday, Like Nothing Compares to You. Sinead O'Connor turns it into a worldwide smash, right? And so this person, Jill Jones, whose relationship with Prince is hardly just about this one very nasty, ugly moment apparently she experienced with him, says the following in reaction to the documentary's cancellation. Quote, "The tragedy lies in the fact that so many refuse to acknowledge the truth of who he really was. The recent choice made by Netflix and his estate only reinforce this truth. The world is unwilling to accept Prince as a man without the elaborate stagecraft, without the veil of mystery. His raw humanity is deemed insufficient. His struggles, his journey, his sacrifices, all the elements that shaped him will remain obscured. Instead, the world will receive, and I've said this at length previously, this is the concern, quote, a sanitized, polished version of Prince, a carefully curated illusion that erases the depth of his reality." Mic drop moment, right? That is as mic drop worthy a quote as any that has been uttered in this entire saga. Again, I remind you, what does Ezra Edelman say about what his documentary does with Prince? You get to bathe in his genius, and yet you also have to confront his humanity. In what universe occupied by rational people is that controversial? Help me out here, please. In the meantime, Ezra says, people keep telling me, oh my God, when do I get to see it? When is it coming out? And Ezra says, and I'm like, mother effer, this isn't going away. And I say, no, you can't see it. I don't feel like getting sued. Now, I alluded to the predicament that revelations such as the one Jill Jones makes in interviews with Ezra and his staff put him in. Help me understand those who believe that Ezra Edelman's project was deliberately, consciously just to slander Prince, as the estate ridiculously claims. What was he supposed to do? He's given this assignment by Netflix, right? He accepts it. And then he goes about his actual job of interviewing relevant sources who in some cases tell him some unseemly things about Prince. Well, what does he do when they make these revelations? Stick his hands in his ears and go, la, 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 I can't hear you, I can't hear you. Is that what he was supposed to do? Would that have been doing his job? Or was his job to follow up on those leads? If he's going to operate within his integrity, that is exactly what he must do. He is morally, ethically bound and compelled to do that. The objective there is not to dig up sleaze. It's, this woman told me something about a disturbing experience she had with Prince. And so, as Ezra Edelman puts it, quote, when someone tells me about a harrowing incident that they experienced, here are my two choices. Oh, why did this happen? Was this something that was consistent within this man's behavior? Can I contextualize what that meant to him in his head? Where did this come from? Or I can be like, oh, they're not going to like that. That might change people's image of Prince, so I better not put that in. Which to him would be, as he put it, quote, committing documentary malpractice. This man's job was not to curate a carefully packaged image of his subject. It was to tell his subject's story with all the integrity that Ezra Edelman could bring to bear. He wasn't just professionally obligated to do that. He was morally obligated to do that. How could this man face himself in the mirror? How could he ever be taken seriously in Hollywood? How certainly could he ever be taken seriously by Jill Jones, who probably would have told others, hey, I let him know about this. It's nowhere in this documentary. The WTF. It's probably what would have happened there. Can you, those of you who have watched my videos on this channel about this topic and have said in comments, and there are plenty of you, oh, I'm so glad this isn't coming out because it was just going to be this dirtbag sleaze fest. Can you, critic of Ezra Edelman, bring enough humility to this issue to understand the predicament this put him in as an artist with integrity? He's sitting there locked eye to eye with Jill Jones, who knew Prince for many years during the most creatively substantial and successful period in the man's entire life, telling him, there was this time when Prince flipped out on me, punched me in the face in a hotel room because I got in his case when he was macking up some other woman right in front of me. Jill Jones, who Ezra Edelman says wanted to be his exclusive woman, wanted her own record deal, wanted to have a career of her own. Does her social media post sound like someone who's in it for something other than just being honest about her experience with this man? And then there's this other argument that Ezra Edelman addresses in this documentary, which is those who suggest this is an invasion of his privacy, to which Ezra Edelman correctly says, of course this was an invasion of his privacy. He's a public figure. He's an historically important subject. He is one of the great artists of the last 100 years. Indeed, he is. We need to understand who these people are, how they made their art, what drove them, how they lived, how they died. It's part of how we go through the world as humans. What are we talking about here? And this is where Ezra Edelman's bewilderment is like that of John the Savage in Brave New World. He's looking around like, are there any people with actual faculties of reason left? Are there any people with emotional maturity involved in this debate here, this dilemma, this discourse, this saga? Ezra Edelman's concern is, quote, that there's an attempt here to make Prince more palatable to an audience in 2025. And he says, this is exactly my issue, as it is mine, Ezra. In the case of the Purple Rain movie, let's take that for example, which apparently I didn't know this until I watched this podcast. The estate is making into a Broadway musical. Well, about that, Ezra has this to say, quote, we're going to revisit it, revamp it, and sanitize it, and in turn sanitize Prince's image for current audiences, for younger audiences, quote, to make him a less troubling figure. To which Ezra says, that is effed up. I'm sorry. And then, importantly, almost heartbreakingly, he says, quote, I don't think my documentary stood much of a chance if this is what's happening. I've gone on about the fact that this is what's happening in the music documentary, music biopic space. Sanitizing the grittier or uglier parts of a person's story. Walking on eggshells around those parts of a person's story. Making sure to sweep under the rug the most essential pieces of what made them human, which in many cases for all of us is our flaws and our mistakes. Which in the cases of these unique individuals, you combine with their incredible world-shaking creative genius and you end up with a very fascinating tale that in Prince's case, as in so many others who occupied the same creative space that he did, amounts to the story of a, quote, tortured genius, which in Prince's case, he undoubtedly was. I've gone over the reasons why that is undoubtedly what he was, a tortured genius, in prior videos on this subject. That especially comes out in the New York Times Magazine story that I discussed at length here at The Curious Listener. Again, go to that playlist about music, biopics, and documentaries that I've set up for you to more easily find that. So to recap, in Ezra's own words, he gets a call saying, quote, hey, what do you think about Prince? We have this entire vault that's never been accessed or seen, and then I also know he's saying Prince is basically this mysterious figure, and I know that his story basically hasn't ever really been told. There's a reason why Prince's story has never been told, Ezra goes on to say. Prince was not someone in life who was ever interested in sharing. He cultivated an air of mystery and did it in a pretty impressively consistent and domineering way. Ezra Edelman says that the question he sought to answer in making this documentary, which is the question to try and answer as someone who embraces a project like this, quote, how did we get from this teenage virtuoso, creative genius who was the youngest artist to be signed by Warner Brothers and be given complete creative control to a guy who died of a drug overdose in an elevator in Paisley Park, in essence died in a box within a box that he built himself. Especially, this is Ezra continuing now, for a guy who in the public's consciousness didn't do drugs. Okay? And these questions that he's asking, how did this happen? How did our culture give rise to this tour de force of creativity, this world-shaking creative genius? Comes up in the case of Bob Dylan, too. Bob Dylan likes to play cutesy with the facts. James Mangold, in a complete unknown, definitely plays cutesy with the facts, right? Departing from the facts in ways that I have said here felt unnecessary and given to sentimentality, sappiness, and maudlin scenes here and there throughout this otherwise critically praised film. Well, as I said in a uh, a prior video on A Complete Unknown, when I'm talking about what I call the elephant in the room of this conversation about A Complete Unknown, is in Dylan's case, this is a Nobel Prize laureate, Nobel Prize in Literature winner. And so that thrusts him into the same stratosphere occupied by other Nobel Prize winning authors like William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, Toni Morrison, right? Well, guess what? Yeah, I mean, it's to American culture's benefit to figure out, unpack this guy's story, understand how our culture gave rise to this genius. How did he develop into this immense talent as a musician, as a songwriter? These are questions that I think the answers to which are going to lend themselves to a better understanding of who we are as Americans, what American culture is, how to define it, how our culture gives rise to these geniuses here and there. Those are the questions that Ezra Edelman sought to answer here. It's not beyond my awareness, by the way, that Bob Dylan and Prince both were Minnesota-born artists, both guys who grew up in Minnesota. And I wonder, I do not have anything corroborating this. Perhaps you do, and if you do, post some links in the comments. Dylan himself is someone who Bruce Springsteen described in an NPR interview with Terry Gross as having, quote, sustained his mystery for 50 years. Dylan was cultivating and sustaining that mystery long before Prince arose on the national cultural scene. I wonder if there is any degree to which Bob Dylan talked with Prince, coached him at all about how to sustain his own mystery, how to protect his own privacy as jealously and in as paranoid a fashion as he evidently did. I just wonder. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. And in the face of that jealous guarding of one's privacy, Ezra Edelman says this, quote, I have a responsibility as a documentarian filmmaker to answer the question, well, how did this happen? What was going on underneath? I was after the truth about this person's existence. His objective, as he says, was, quote, to try to shed some light on who this person was. No one knows who this dude was. I'm going to try to effing figure this out, he says at one point. And importantly, he also makes the point that Prince is not R. Kelly. That's not what's going on here. Not even close. He says this, quote, this isn't, by the way, R. Kelly, who was sentenced, by the way, to 20 years in prison for child sex crimes. We already know what he's guilty of, Ezra says, and you're just like exposing really hard truths, and people need to know this because this guy's got to go down. This wasn't that, but people were sort of defensive as though this guy were that. He wasn't. Now, he concedes at one point that this kind of, as he calls it, microscopic examination of Prince's story, the life of this mysterious man, was going to unearth some things that were, as he put it, a little scummy at times. But, quote, the whole point of it is the journey reflecting the journey that he went through. At one point, he says that the sum of this film is greater than its parts, as any great documentary must be. Then he rehashes the story of how the Prince estate was given the license to check the film for factual inaccuracies. That was the only liberty they had with respect to their feedback about this film. That's how it has to be. If you're going to give an honest appraisal of the man's work, the man's own estate can have an overbearing influence on the outcome of this project. He says instead, as you've heard from me previously, they came back with a 17-page document full of editorial issues, not concerns about factual accuracy, although they went out in the press and pretended otherwise, wildly, rampantly accusing him of factual inaccuracy after factual inaccuracy. And as I have said repeatedly at this channel for months now, long before this podcast was recorded with Ezra Edelman by Pablo Torre, and thank you, Pablo, for doing this. He says, quote, do you think I have any interest in putting out a film that is factually inaccurate? Do you understand? This is a 50-year-old man with plenty of career ahead and a glittering career behind him too, having won an Academy Award. Does he want to soil the rest of his career with irresponsible journalism? Why would he do that? Now, and then Ezra, of course, and I've said this too, he says the estate's going to put out its own documentary, but that's not a documentary. It's going to be a hagiographic propaganda love letter to the artist. Are you going to learn anything about Prince? I doubt it, Ezra says. Are you going to learn anything dark about Prince? I doubt it, Ezra says. Are you going to learn anything complicating about Prince? I doubt it, Ezra says. 100% right. But Ezra, and this is important because listen to the language he uses here, and you tell me if this sounds like the language of a man who was hell bent on slandering Prince. He concedes that this documentary, The Prince Estate, is going to put out this documentary, quote, will be wildly popular because people want to see Prince, and deservedly so, he says. The guy was one of the great entertainers, performers, musicians of all time, and that's what's really sad. He goes on to say, I cried watching him in his 1982 performance during the Controversy Tour when he was singing When You Were Mine. He is a magnetic performer. Again, are these the words of someone who interpreted this project as permission and license to do nothing with it except dig up sleaze on the guy and tarnish his reputation? So my takeaways from this conversation are a few here. Again, there's nothing controversial about this Prince documentary except to those within the Prince estate. As Pablo mentions, Hollywood is a graveyard of passion projects. This is not new, except that in this case, Edelman devoted what he describes, as I said, as 1/10 of his life to this project. As Edelman says, quote, this happens to be such an extreme high-profile episode in documentary filmmaking. Exactly. This isn't just your run-of-the-mill passion project swept under the rug of Hollywood bureaucracy and politics. Okay? And on that note, personally, I deeply hope that Hollywood rallies behind Ezra Edelman, because doing so would be to step up for all artists in the documentary space who are fighting to do their work as members of what Ezra Edelman correctly identifies as the fourth estate, which is to unearth and report the truth of any story they are exploring. To which I respond with another concern, which is, do we even know what the truth is anymore? I think this is part of what Ezra's getting at in this conversation. As he says, right now we live in a culture where the subject gets to dictate who they are and everybody, and that is not the way the fourth estate is set up. My issue with that is in trading for access, you have a lot of companies and filmmakers making deals with the subject, sanitizing their story and or their images. It serves them, but it isn't truthful. And he goes on to draw this culinary analogy, saying the public doesn't seem to care or know the difference. They're being served slop. And they're like, oh, this is short rib. But no, Ezra says, it's not. It is slop. That's the bigger issue, he says. This Prince film is a full meal. It is not something you can tear through. It's tough at times. The sum is greater than its parts. That's the whole point. And Pablo ends this conversation by asking the perfect question, which is, would Ezra Edelman do this all over again if he could? Listen to his response. He goes, and have it turn out the same way? No, absolutely not. Would I have done anything differently in the process that led to this result? No. I feel that I honestly, earnestly tried my hardest to make the best film and reacted to the circumstances I was presented as truthfully and honestly to who I am and my belief system as possible. You make the choices that are in front of you based on who you are. And I think, based on the circumstances I was presented with, at every point, I did what I believe to be the correct thing, and that I'll have to live with. That I'll live with, he says. He will live with that. And then heartbreakingly, he says, there is nothing about this that I will get over. It's just not possible. But it is so helpful, so illuminating, if heartbreaking. To get Edelman's side of the story, nothing about it surprises me. It is exactly as we have thought it is here at The Curious Listener, as you and I have been talking about for months now. Do yourself a favor, whether you're a supporter of Edelman or a critic of his, whether you share the Prince Estate's suspicions about his motives or not. Go into the description of this video, tap on the Pablo Torre video, and watch it for yourself. Listen to Ezra Edelman put this in his own words, and come to your own conclusions after having absorbed the entirety of that conversation. Then see what you think. See if it changes your mind. Maybe it doesn't. And get back to me here in the comments. I'd love to hear from you after you've watched the Pablo Torre conversation. Let me know if it changed your mind about what truly has happened here amid this travesty, in my view, that has befallen what probably was going to be a groundbreaking, great, deeply incisive, an illuminating documentary about a world shaking genius in Prince who deserved nothing less.